Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Energy Storage News webinar with Wärtsilä, Demystifying the Battery Storage System Performance Metrics that Matter Most. I'm Andy Colthorpe, Editor of Energy Storage News and Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Publishing at Solar Media. It is often said that success with battery energy storage system, or BESS projects, requires a complex balancing act in trading off the value created from charging, storing, and discharging against the value of the batteries themselves. In other words, how aggressively they can be cycled and utilized in applications that include energy shifting, arbitrage, trading, or grid services, how long they will last before needing replacements or approaching the operating limits stipulated in their warranties, and so on. Many of the keys to understanding the practice behind that theoretical premise, as our expert speakers will explain far better than I can, are found in how the condition and status of each system or portfolio can be tracked from the cell level up. These metrics that matter most, from state of charge and state of health to round-trip efficiency and real-time usable energy and cell imbalance, are referred to so often that sometimes it's important to remember that as an industry, while we're all in the same metaphorical tall building together, ascending to the top, we didn't all get in the elevator on the same floor. I've been reporting on the industry for a business audience for over a decade now, yet it is perhaps only in the past couple of years or so that the emphasis on understanding these metrics and their importance has spread from the teams directly working on projects to a broader field of stakeholders. So we're very excited that our sponsors and partners today are sharing valuable insights and information that I believe can benefit everyone, from absolute beginners to industry veterans. Our speakers today are Andrea Meister, Senior Battery Management System Product Manager at Wärtsilä, and Steve Merrick, Wärtsilä's Senior Product Manager for Battery Analytics. As always, interaction with you, the audience, is very important to us. Please submit your questions for the speakers in the Questions tab on the right-hand side of your screen. And I think maybe the Q&A following Andrea and Steve's presentation might be where the discussion really comes alive. For some of you who are more familiar with the metrics and their implications for BESS operation, optimization, and lifetime management already. So do take this opportunity to ask your questions. We will not be able to tackle all of your questions within the time we have allotted for today's broadcast, but please rest assured that Wärtsilä will be happy to follow up and respond in full, continuing those discussions offline. And finally, from me, this session is being recorded and will be available in a few working days on the on-demand webinar section of the ESN website, along with presentation slides. And I would just like to point out, as a small point of order and apology, that I think a couple of the slides may appear a little bit blurry in the broadcast version that you'll see today. That won't be the case once you have the slides sent out to you. But yeah, we do apologize for that. You should be able to see the nuance of what the slides are representing. But yeah, I do hope it doesn't impair your enjoyment. And with that, it's my great pleasure to hand over to our speakers for today. And going first is Andrea Meister. Hi, Andrea.
Hey, Andy, and hi, everybody. Thank you, ESN, for hosting us, and thanks to the pretty good number of people on today's webinar. I'm Andrea Meister, and I work at Wärtsilä. If you don't know us, we're one of the top BESS providers globally. We manage about 18 gigawatt hours of energy storage. We build that hardware, software, and do the services on those platforms. And we're really excited to chat with you about some of the things that we've been doing. I guess if you've heard of one thing that Wärtsilä does, that's our GEMS energy management platform that I'll be chatting about a little bit today. I am so excited to be joined by Steve Merrick, who is having a super rad day as the product that he's been working on for about a year, sort of in stealth mode, got to launch this morning.
Hey, thanks, Andrea. Yeah, nice to meet everyone. Steve Merrick here, product manager for battery analytics. And yeah, as you mentioned, we launched GEMS Pulse, our battery analytics solution today. So super excited about that. And I'm excited to share a little bit about how that can solve some of the problems Andrea will frame up. But yeah, looking forward to the discussion today.
Excellent. We put together this presentation, as Andy alluded to, because we saw a lot of these performance metrics like SoC accuracy or maintaining a high SoH and preventing degradation as items that we see a lot of discussion on, but often we see presenters or customers in the industry sort of talking past each other because we don't have a shared understanding of what are those parameters and how can we optimize them. So we wanted to use this as primarily an educational session to help build from first principles what those parameters are, how they're used, things like that. So to that end, we're looking to build that shared understanding, define those key parameters, take a deeper dive into SoC estimation, as that's a big point of order. Take a look at why it's challenging in LFP battery chemistries, and ways that we might increase its accuracy. Third, we're going to take a look at all of those other metrics: state of health, cell imbalance, and the impact that they have on real-time usable energy, a term that we'll get into in a little bit. And then after sort of building the first principles there, or that sort of from the basics understanding, I'll hand it over to Steve to talk more about what are how those parameters come out in software, how they are used, and how they can be viewed and optimized throughout an entire software and hardware stack. So with that, let's chat about those key parameters, just to get on the same page about some of the terms that we're going to be using during this presentation. So state of charge is how much energy you have in your battery at any given time, shown as a percentage of your maximum possible energy. So 50% state of charge means you've used half your energy, you have 50%, half remaining. Something that's interesting about state of charge is it is a calculated, not a measured parameter. So unlike going outside and measuring the temperature in degrees C or degrees Fahrenheit, state of charge is an estimation that's meant to help you understand how best to use your battery. State of health is that maximum possible capacity of your battery. So what your battery can hold at any given time. And that's shown as a percentage of the initial capacity at manufacturing. The flip side of state of health is degradation. So if your degradation increases, your state of health decreases. We'll use some of those terms interchangeably in our presentation today. The last one that I think causes folks the most trouble is cell imbalance. This is the stranded energy or capacity that the battery can't access because the battery is composed of many different cells that have small differences in cell size or in the present SoC. And I see sometimes there's some confusion between these metrics. I think one of the big reasons is that they all feed into real-time usable energy, or the amount of energy that can be discharged by the BESS at any given time. This is really what an operation, and particularly a trading operation, cares about. They want to know, all right, so how much can I discharge? How can I meet my off-taker arrangements? Things like that. I think another challenge that keeps folks from being able to sort of separate these out is that a lot of these parameters are measured at a similar time in the charge cycle, and that the accuracy of one can impact the accuracy of another. For example, it's hard to measure a state of health accuracy accurately if your final and initial state of charge wasn't accurate to begin with. So those are some of the challenges that can come up, and we'll dig into all of those to a greater extent. So do we have any runners in the audience? I know we must have a few. I guess I can't see any hands raised, but I often think about these battery metrics sort of like going for, like, you know, training for a marathon or going for a run. State of charge is sort of how far you think you can run. It's an estimate. It's your best guess. State of health is your PR, your personal best, your how far you can run on your best day. Cell imbalance is sort of how accessible that energy might be. You know, are you also, you know, lifting weights in the morning? Do you have a long day at work ahead? You know, that you might be sort of suctioning off energy to use. And then real-time usable energy is what your actual performance is when you go for that run that day. So I want to dig into each of these concepts a bit more. And then first, I'd like to chat about state of charge, that sort of estimation of how much energy is in your battery at any given time. And to sort of understand the problem here, I want to look back in time a bit. So 20, 30 years ago, when lead acid was a dominant chemistry in batteries, it was pretty easy to manage state of charge estimation. Basically, the state of charge versus the open circuit voltage as measured, you know, that's a straight line. You take, you know, 2.05 volts per cell, and that's your 50% state of charge. Pretty easy and straightforward. You know, a few years on, when NMC chemistries become more popular, it gets a little bit more challenging because the slope of that line isn't totally linear, but still you can pull off a one-to-one relationship from open circuit voltage to state of charge. The problem comes in LFP chemistries, where open circuit voltage and state of charge correlation isn't extremely helpful. If, for example, if you have measure the open circuit voltage of 3.3 volts per cell, due to that long flat part of the LFP curve, we could see, you know, a state of charge anywhere that, you know, is it 60%? Is it 80%? We don't know. So open circuit voltage doesn't tell us everything that we need to know about a battery's state of charge. And methodologies that only use open circuit voltage as a measurement, or operations that basically only allow for this kind of calibration that we'll talk about a little bit more, lead to about 20 to 30% error in state of charge at a minimum. So it's obviously we need to improve upon this kind of performance. That wouldn't be good performance in any battery. So there are three primary ways that we better our SoC estimate. The first is to calibrate on parts of the open circuit voltage curve where we do see some slope, where the open circuit voltage does mean something about the state of charge. Those are in the high and low SoC ranges. So, you know, in the 98, 99% state of charge on the high end, or on the low end at, you know, under 20 to 30% state of charge. We find that most batteries, including our BESS, work a little, it's a little bit easier to use the low end of that state of charge calibration range because it's a little easier to steer into that wider range. To calibrate, we also require rest to sort of shake off the effects of a most recent charge and wait 60 minutes, measure that open circuit voltage, and have calibrated. The second thing you can do is to track the charge and discharge since that last calibration to measure the present SoC. And then third, which is an area that this industry is starting to explore, is using model-based techniques to better understand how the battery will respond to operational conditions, having known something very precise about how that battery works. Let's dig into all of these, starting with calibration. So calibration paradigms will differ somewhat depending on the primary application of that BESS. With the Wärtsilä GEMS PPC, we are able to stack operations. So a site can both perform solar shifting and ancillary services, but we do find that sites tend to divide themselves based on what the market needs. So let's talk first about ancillary services, or a site where most of the time a battery is between 40 to 80% state of charge. In that paradigm, a site operator would set the calibration frequency, and the GEMS PPC's role there is to round robin through units, bringing them down to the calibration range, resting them, calibrating that SoC, measuring that with the BMS, and then steering that back up into participation. At a solar shifting site, we see a little bit different of a role there of those components and what might be expected. So at a solar shifting site, for example, we see a lot of charge during the daytime, discharge in the evening, and that battery is being cycled from, it could be from 100% to nearly 0% state of charge every day. This allows for some natural calibrations to happen. And during that, the PPC's primary role is to hold those strings, during those very low states of charge, during the night at zero current, and pausing any, ancillary services that might have stacked operations to perform calibration, and then re-entering those strings into the market. These sites also have different needs. At an ancillary services site, really you need a PPC like the GEMS PPC to steer strings into that calibration range. We can do that automatically. That varies between different providers and operations. And we can also see that fast calibrations can be effective, as any amount of time that battery's paused ancillary services, some revenues lost. So some fast calibrations, after resting for only 3 to 5 minutes, can be effective there. At solar shifting sites or energy arbitrage sites, we see more of those natural rest periods, but we also see a need for highly accurate SoCs to effectively perform arbitrage or meet offtake agreements. And fast calibrations we see as less accurate and can often lead to further inaccuracies. So those fast calibrations, 3 to 5 minutes, that some OEM BMSs perform, are honestly throwing off the calibration here. The second method, so we talked about calibrations there. The second method to get SoC more accurate is colloquially called Coulomb counting, or tracking the current in and out of the battery to estimate the SoC. So for example, if you have a 300 amp hour cell, and that takes half C charge for 1 hour, you'd expect that to be at 50% SoC. In a similar sort of simplified example, a quarter C discharge for 1 hour from that 50% SoC mark brings us down to 25% SoC. And this is a simple example of a Coulomb counting operation that a BESS will do for each cell and for each and over again between charges, sort of stacking up those charges and discharges. With those sort of traditional methods, we took a look at 9 sites that use just those kinds of traditional methods on an OEM BMS. And we found that SoC error, or the jump that occurs during calibration, can be dramatic. So most of those errors are under the 8% SoC error, but we see a pretty good number of them in the 10, 12, 15% error. And what that looks like to the operation is a jump in SoC. So for example, in this top graph at 9:30, the operation thought they were totally out of charge. And then upon calibration, we see that actually they had 20% of their state of charge remaining. That's, when that SoC jumps higher, that's a missed revenue opportunity. you know, a miss, but all right. Our analysis shows that actually SoC is just as likely to jump lower from in some of these OEM BMSs. So SoC, when SoC corrects lower, that's an area where there might be a market non-compliance issue, or an agreement with an off-taker is violated because your SoC, you didn't have as much energy as you thought you did. So clearly some more modern methods that we implement are needed to, avoid these kinds of error that lead to market non-compliance issues. One way that we do this at Wärtsilä is model-based SoC estimation. We're able to test battery cells in a lab under which conditions are much more of a given, and create a model for our terminal voltage modeled against SoC. And then able to compare what we'd expect from a model-based SoC given field conditions with the field SoC from Coulomb counting, and then learn from that as the operation continues. The last method I'll talk about for accurately estimating SoC is accounting for hysteresis. Even after resting, OCV changes depending on the most recent battery activity, so whether it was charging or discharging. And you can see from the discrepancy in these voltage versus state of charge curves that even as you calibrate the period where you should have the most accurate SoC estimate, the charging and discharging OCV are quite different, meaning that if you aren't accounting for this hysteresis effect, there are, even your calibrations could be inaccurate. So we chatted about state of charge there. I gave you guys a bit of the high level of how we might solve problems in state of charge accuracy. Next, I want to turn our attention to those sort of capacity challenges, state of health, keeping that high, and cell imbalance, keeping that low. So in a perfect world, we have all balanced battery cells. So, they're all at 50% at one time, meaning that as you discharge, they all hit 0% at the same time. And as you charge up, all battery cells hit 100% state of charge at the same time. Unfortunately, we do not live in a perfect world, and we see slightly uneven percentages in different SoC percentages in different cells in a module. This presents challenge. This comes because of, could be because of slight differences in the battery cell size at manufacturing, how fast it's degraded, or an uneven current draw as the battery discharges and performs other operations. So when we see unbalanced battery cells, that means as the battery discharges, the first cell to hit 0% state of charge stops the whole battery from discharging. This happens because the BMS is one of the BMS's core jobs is to protect the battery from over discharging and hence damaging any of the cells in that module. So we'll stop when we hit 0%, when one cell hits 0% state of charge, leaving this sort of wasted energy on the table. And then on the flip side, as we're charging up, we'll see sort of this inability to reach the full capacity because the same thing happens, with one cell capping us out from preventing an over voltage issue at 100% state of charge. One thing to note here is that one imbalanced cell affects every cell at the inverter level. From an imbalance perspective, this is one of the most important reasons that the industry is moving from container level inverters to string level inverters. You're just having one bad cell is having less of an impact on the total amount of stranded capacity. This is also a huge challenge in identifying the location of your imbalance and resolving it, which Steve will talk a little bit more about with the Pulse product and how a good and sort of integrated battery analytics tool can help resolve some of these challenges. So we resolve at the micro level, we resolve imbalance with the BMS measuring cell level SoC and creating a balancing plan during those times of calibration. Then during operation and rest, the balancing plan is executed. So energy is discharged through resistors. This is called passive balancing. Transferred between cells. This is called active balancing. And if cell imbalance, can't slowly be resolved in that way, you can have a service interaction to perform manual balancing. State of health, so we might consider cell imbalance to be a resolvable capacity issue. It's something that we can change, can modify, put effort towards, and regain capacity of a battery. State of health is an unresolvable capacity issue. Degradation is a permanent impact on those cells, and impacts in a similar way. So a quick little preview of what we might see in a battery analytics tool about this is we have a bit of a screenshot from Pulse here. So that top line, that's our maximum total capacity. And then you can see there between the top line and the bottom and the next line down, that's your cell imbalance. That's like potentially recoverable capacity. This is the screenshot I pulled this from is a really healthy site. The imbalance hovers at about 1% here. Whereas in the industry, we see, anywhere from like single digits to 15% imbalance. And then farther down, we see SoH sort of over the contractual capacity. So that dotted line is the estimated capacity that a battery vendor might provide about how the battery will degrade versus what the actual measured state of health is. So I gave a bit of an overview, I gave the sort of first principles of, what are state of charge, state of health, cell imbalance, why are they sometimes hard to understand or measure, and how do they impact your best performance? I now want to hand it over to Steve, who's going to chat a little bit about how can you find this out about your system in real time, and how does a native battery analytics tool really help uncover some of these performance issues that we talked about sort of at the high level, and how do we resolve those by knowing what they are and figuring out how to resolve them? Steve, would you mind taking it from here?
Thanks, Andrea. By the way, I am a runner too. I raised my hand. But yeah, I want to talk a bit about the challenges that Andrea discussed and what they mean for asset operators. And so we see that there are three key components to a battery system to address these kind of problems. This is the BMS, power plant controller, and battery analytics. And I'm going to walk through these by using state of charge as an example. So the BMS, this is our embedded software. It communicates between the cells and the battery cells and any pure software components. And as it relates to state of charge, as Andrea mentioned, it does the actual SoC calculation. So it's calculating that on a constant basis. But its purview is limited to just the string or the container, whatever level the BMS is at. Then the PPC, if we're going to think at the site level, that's where the PPC's purview is. And so it coordinates grid level activities. So if there's a certain power requirement at the point of interconnect, the PPC is making sure that's taking place. And it also will direct different inverters to a level, like a state of charge or voltage level, where a calibration can actually take place. So they play together nicely in that way. And then a battery analytics solution also looks across the site level, and it is looking to optimize the performance of these calibrations. You might have like a problem child who needs to calibrate really frequently because the imbalance is high or the SoC accuracy is low, or you might have like a star pupil that actually can wait a long time between calibrations. Maybe that only needs to be like every 4 or 6 months or something. And so a battery analytics solution can help provide that level of visibility. We like to think about all of these in the analogy of a three-legged stool. And if one leg of the stool isn't pulling its weight, it's not a good situation. For example, if the BMS is providing bad measurements, it's basically, but the power plant controller and battery analytics or rock stars, it's kind of garbage in, garbage out. You can analyze all you want, but if the data is not useful, then there's really no point. Or if you have a great BMS and a great power plant controller, but no battery analytics, you're missing some of that overall site level optimization in order for this to be the most effective solution possible. And so our perspective at Wärtsilä is that an integrated solution is optimal. We've developed all three of these components in-house from the ground up. We have our Wärtsilä BMS, we have the GEMS power plant controller, and yeah, as of today, we have GEMS Pulse, our battery analytics solution that I'm particularly proud of. And we think that this is a great combination because they integrate with each other very closely and natively. And this can be in contrast where you can get all three of these from different suppliers and different vendors, but then the integration between them is tricky. And so that's where we are at Wärtsilä quite proud of this integrated approach. So I want to talk through some other applications of what Andrea talked about and what this means for battery operators. But I want to frame this discussion around three key customer problems. So the first one is lot capacity. How do I get as many megawatt hours as possible out of my asset? The second one is around optimizing your operations, proactive maintenance, addressing things before they actually impact the site. And then the third one is around battery degradation. Whenever you're using a battery, it is degrading. Depending on how you use it, it degrades at different rates. So how does one think about that? And to start with, we're going to think about lot capacity. And I think there's basically two camps here, or two components. The first one is understanding how much energy is actually in my asset. This is an imprecise science, like Andrea mentioned. State of charge is an estimate, it is not a measurement. So first of all, we want to know how much energy is in there right now. And then we want to minimize any stranded capacity. So these are really the two components of lot capacity. And I want to start by talking about the uncertainty. So here we have a battery system on the left. It's about 100 megawatt hours, and it has the asset operator here is using on a day-by-day basis 80 megawatt hours, and they're holding in buffer 20%, or like roughly 20 megawatt hours. They are probably wanting to avoid the risk of making a bid into the market and then not being able to fulfill that at the bottom of their SoC range. So if they were to bid like 20 megawatt hours and then they only had 10 left, they might have to cover that commitment in the real-time market, which has an uncertain financial cost. Or in like the worst case scenario, they could get in trouble with the market operator if they make certain market commitments in ancillary markets and can't fulfill them. So we have seen many battery operators put in place a predefined buffer in terms of how much of the energy or assets capacity they actually trade on. 20% is maybe on the higher end, 10% fairly common. So, you might go from 95% down to 5%, that kind of thing. But long story short, this is what we have seen from many folks. And what is this buffer coming from? Like, what are all these areas of uncertainty? That's state of charge inaccuracy, imbalance. We want to understand how degradation is unfolding, and then, of course, factor in any unit level outages. But all of these are like area unknowns. And so many folks will just say, okay, to account for that, I don't know the precise value, I'll just put in place this buffer. What we want to help folks get to is to give certainty around all four of these areas of uncertainty. And so to give precision around, okay, I think, what is my SoC? I have an estimate, but how accurate is that estimate? What are the error bars around that? I know I have imbalance, but exactly how much imbalance do I have? And our aim then is to provide certainty around the amount of usable energy at any point in time, so that asset operators can make more confident trades and to trade within a wider range. So our hope is that increased tradable range will allow folks to make more money. And this is where all of this rolls up into the concept that Andrea had mentioned, that we call real-time usable energy, that's driven by GEMS Pulse, and then our BMS, focused on our Quantum 3 product down the road. And what this looks like is, it's 4 p.m. on a Tuesday. We tell you that you have 60 megawatt hours of dischargeable energy at full power with a predefined error bar on that. And then, hours gone by, now you have 40 megawatt hours of dischargeable power with a defined error bar. And that's the level that we are focusing on, so that folks have confidence around the uncertainty and that we can quantify that uncertainty. And we think that this is a problem that should matter to asset operators. We ran an analysis, and looking at just one of the areas of uncertainty, state of charge, a 5% SoC error could cause roughly a $10 per megawatt annual loss. And this is in the ERCOT market. And if we roll that up to a 100 megawatt 2-hour system, we could be looking at around $1 million a year. And over the lifetime, this could scale up to like $15 to $20 million of foregone revenue. So this is a problem that we think is relevant and can impact the financial performance of an asset in a material way. Coming back to the other component of lot capacity, okay, now we understand, like, we have precision on how much energy is actually in the asset. So we've hopefully stripped away some of those buffers that are in place and replaced that with knowing the amount of energy that's chargeable or dischargeable at full power, which is real-time usable energy. But we still might have some imbalance remaining, and that is like something that we want to reduce. So we want to try to unlock that actual stranded energy. So how might we approach that? And one approach that many folks take, and we take at Wärtsilä here as well, is SoC calibration. And we take an approach that we call an SoC calibration algorithm, where we automatically calibrate each system on a rolling basis. So if we turn this on and you have like 100 battery systems or inverters at a site, we're going to automatically cycle through those on a rolling basis so that each one gets calibrated, let's say, every 2 weeks. And when that calibration happens, the SoC will be reset to its most possible accurate level, and a balancing plan will take place so that the imbalance of the system can be reduced. And we do this in a way that doesn't impact the maximum power output of the site. And if we think about this, that stool that I showed before that had the BMS and the PPC and the battery analytics, like, that integration is important for this. The BMS needs to do the calibration. The PPC is deciding which inverters go down and moves the power level or energy levels down to a point where the calibration can take place. And the battery analytics is help thinking, like, is it a rock star pupil, or is it a problem child? Like, how often should I do these calibrations? This is where that integrated solution is quite valuable. Next customer problem is around optimizing operations. So this is along the lines of proactive maintenance. How can I fix issues before they become significant ones? And we call this anomaly detection within the GEMS Pulse application. But another way to think about this is finding needles in a haystack. So we get loads and loads of data off these battery sites. It can be tens of thousands of data points per second. And we're talking temperature and current and chiller data and inverter data and lots of stuff. And it can be a monumental task to try to sort through. And so our aim here is to try to filter through all that data and identify the things that really matter to customers, and things that they can take action on to make the site as optimal as possible. And so, for example, one might be imbalance. Let's say we have a site like the one Andrea showed earlier, where imbalance is like 1%, but you still want to unlock as much energy as possible. Perhaps there are like 2 inverters where imbalance is consistently above 7%. We can try to identify that and identify the trends over time, and then those can be addressed on an individual basis. Another example is weak cells. So if there, as Andrea mentioned as well, there's a single cell that can hit the top of the voltage range or SoC range and be the first one to hit the bottom. And so that cell is actually limiting all of the energy behind a single inverter, and it's basically degraded faster than all the other ones. And so this is something that might be a candidate for replacement, for replacing a module. But finding these can be quite tricky. Another example is internal resistance. And this can result in uneven currents between strings. And eventually, if it goes on long enough, that can result in uneven degradation. And if the gap gets wide enough, one of the strings can actually trip offline and you might get an outage, which of course we want to prevent. So aim is to try to identify this emerging trend before it actually impacts the system level. And then finally, we can also look at things like chiller performance. We have a desired chiller set point, but are the cells that are being chilled by that chiller actually reaching that set point, or is there some sort of deviation? If there is a deviation, this could point to an issue with the chiller itself, and if not addressed, can also lead to uneven rates of degradation, or even unplanned maintenance visits down the road. So really, this is all thinking around how do I take proactive steps on my system, not like, oh my gosh, there's a blaring alarm, go fix it. That's a different application, but this is like, how do I think about optimizing it as much as possible in the long term? And then the last area is around battery degradation. And it's important to think about the impact of how a site operates on both the revenue side, of course, but also what is the impact on my degradation? If I'm making money hand over fist and riding my asset really hard, like that's great this year, but is that the right choice for the next 10 years? Like these are some interesting questions. And before we dive too deep into that, I want to talk about some things that are drivers of degradation. So the first one is depth of discharge. This is the percentage of total capacity that is used during an operation. So if your battery is at 80% and you discharge all the way down to 0, that would be an 80% depth of discharge. If the battery is at 70% and you discharge down to 20%, that would be a 50% depth of discharge. So, it's the amount of max capacity that's used in a discharge operation. And generally, the impact on degradation is that the higher the depth of discharge, the greater the rate of degradation. So the highest possible one would be like 100% down to 0%. That would have the most significant impact on degradation. Many frequency market applications that have the asset fluttering between 40 and 60% will have a lower impact on degradation. Temperature is another factor, and this is specifically talking about the temperature that the battery cells are exposed to. 25C is an example here, but long story short, the higher the temperature that they're exposed to, the greater the degradation impact. But sometimes there's a trade-off where you can get a bit more energy out if the temperature is higher as well. And then cycles per day. To define this is the number of complete charge to discharge cycles that the battery completes during a day. So if the battery goes from 100% down to 0, that would be 1 cycle. If it goes from 50% down to 0, that would be a half cycle. But then if in the same day it goes from 50% down to 0% again, we'd have another half cycle. So add them up, we have 1 full cycle in that day. So you can have, lots of smaller operations that add up to the total number of cycles per day. And I think you're noticing a trend here. The more cycles per day that take place, the higher the impact on degradation. And then finally, there is the C rate. So this is the power rate that the battery is discharged at, and it's basically a ratio that indicates how long it would take for a battery system to fully discharge. So a half C rate here means that it would take a battery 2 hours to discharge at that specific power level. A C rate of 1 would be 1 hour to discharge fully at that specified power level. And basically, the higher the C rate, the more power you're using, or the higher the rate of power, the greater the degradation as well. It's not saying all of these are like bad for them to be higher. It's just these are the trade-offs. When these indicators are higher, you can be making more money, but also there's a degradation cost, and that's a trade-off that's important to consider. And one way that we are thinking about this is with an application called scenario generation. And so the idea is to take all of those indicators that I just talked about, CP rate, depth of discharge, cycles per day, temperature, and help asset operators understand how their asset will degrade over the long term. So for example, if a battery's been in operation for a couple of years, we'll measure and understand its operational profile over that time and map out that impact on degradation. And then we can answer questions along the lines of, if you keep operating as is, how long will this battery last until the end of its useful life? What if you wanted to change your trading strategy? You had been doing ancillary services for the last couple of years and now shifting towards solar shifting, maybe a few more cycles per day, perhaps a greater depth of discharge. What is the impact going to be on the degradation here? Questions around timing of augmentation. I'm in my financial model, like when do I actually need to do this augmentation based on my current operating strategy? Or perhaps an asset operator is considering a long-term capacity contract. They're going to sign a 5-year capacity contract, but like how big should it be? That might be driven by how much the battery will degrade over the next 5 years. So these are the types of questions that we think are important for asset operators to think about, feedback that we've gotten, and that we would like to enable folks to think through with GEMS Pulse. And I guess one other interesting example, we also found that for a specific site, that if the site operated at 100% depth of discharge and 1 cycle per day, that was equivalent to operating at 1.3 cycles per day and 80% depth of discharge. Degradation rate would be essentially the same. So it's also interesting to think about that there's sort of multiple points of similar degradation based on different operating strategies. So yeah, that is the end of our content today. Thank you all for listening. And I'd like to hand over now back to Andy to facilitate some Q&A.
Superb. Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you, Andrea. So many great questions coming in that I am going to skip any sort of preamble and just let's try and go straight into them. Do you want to say, obviously, keep them coming in because Wärtsilä will be more than happy to respond to them offline for those we can't do. But yeah, Sean, thank you very much for your question. Sean asks, are state of charge and depth of discharge any different other than being opposite measures? And is there a reason to track both? I think that pertains to your earlier part of the presentation, I guess, Andrea. So if you want to start with that, and then if Steve's got me 2 pence of thoughts to throw in, then by all means.
Steve, you've actually been running a depth of discharge study recently, so I'd love it if you grab this one.
Over to Steve. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, if I understand right, it's a difference between state of charge and depth of discharge. And yeah, in my mind, like these are sort of different concepts. Like depth of discharge would be if you're going to go from like 80% down to 0% during an operation, that would be an 80% depth of discharge. But your state of charge will vary, throughout that time. It'll start at 80 and it'll go to 79, 78, all the way down to 0. And so one is looking at exactly how much energy is in the battery right now, state of charge, and the other one's thinking about, okay, during this entire operation, how much of the capacity did I use from start to finish?
Okay, sure. And then going straight into a question from Kilan. So thank you for your question there, Kilan. Lately, we've been seeing that the utility / off-taker doesn't allow operation beyond the contractual energy. And with systems having massive overbuilds, we don't operate from 0 to 100% state of charge range. How will the power plant controller perform calibration if that's the case? And I guess, since we can broaden that out, not just the power plant controller, but obviously the analytics platform as well, I guess. But yeah, just in terms of that, whatever the contractual limits agreed with the utility offtake or whoever the offtaker is, I guess. I think that's maybe the bigger picture part of the question.
Yeah, I think that question touches on a couple of really good points. First of all, as our measurements get more accurate in this industry, we can also reduce overbuild. We talked a lot about sort of optimizing existing assets in this presentation, but I see a huge opportunity with a highly accurate measure of real-time usable energy to be able to reduce that overbuild size, and save customers and eventually energy users money on some of those items. Second, I think the question was specifically around PPC calibration and how, if we're not reaching those natural rest times, how we can manage that. With the Wärtsilä GEMS auto calibration, we can just set up auto calibration at that site. We talked about optimizing sort of those natural rest periods at a solar shifting or an energy arbitrage site, but that's sort of an opportunity where we can sort of get a little bonus, but we can set for example, every 2 weeks calibration frequency with the GEMS auto calibration in that sort of instance.
Okay, sure. And I noticed, Steve, obviously exciting day for you having launched the Pulse product, but I think you've been remarkably and admirably restrained in not kind of touting the sales pitch. That said, we had a ton of questions about it, so I think it's fair to do one. So Clint, thank you so much for your question. I was asking you to clarify what the product is. Is it software that gives a more accurate estimation of SoC and imbalance, or is it hardware that manages the battery and, for example, corrects out of balance conditions? Now, I think you may have addressed some of those points subsequently after Clint asked the question, but I think it maybe bears repeating.
Oh, yeah, it's a great question. It is software that helps optimize the long-term performance of your asset, but it works closely together with our hardware. It works closely together with the BMS and works closely together with the PPC. So some of the specific things that it does is that we'd work with the BMS to help have a more accurate estimate of SoC and a measure of imbalance and an understanding of degradation, so that we can tell you precisely how much energy is chargeable or dischargeable in your asset at any point in time. So that's one end application. Where we're also looking at taking all of the data that comes in from these sites, the tens of thousands of data points per second sometimes, and turning those into actionable insights. So saying, hey, I think you really should think about balancing the specific system more frequently. There's a weak cell over there. Or, oh, there's this trend that is going to lead to long-term degradation on these two strings and maybe even trip them offline. Like, this would be a good thing to look at proactively. And at the same time, we are looking at trends and overall trends of degradation, of imbalance, of contractual capacity to provide that sort of overall analytical view of the system. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I mean, we'll save some of the other questions specific to the Pulse product itself, so that you can follow those up offline. But I think it's definitely great to get that overview. So interesting question here from Alice. Thank you very much for your question, Alice. Asking, isn't it standard for battery OEM, to require an operating state of charge buffer anyway? For example, 5 to 95% as a warranty condition.
So there are a couple questions to this end about how do we protect the battery while trying to get the most out of it. An area we didn't cover on so dramatically is one of the core, basically the core function of any battery management system, in addition to sort of all of the sort of bonus optimization that we talked about in this presentation, is to protect the battery cells and keep them safe. That means, prevent degradation as possible, prevent any sort of thermal events, prevent any warranty conditions being violated. And there are 5 parameters that a BMS is looking at to sort of make sure we're staying safe on all of those categories. So those are under and over voltage, over current. We don't want more current to be drawn or put in than the battery's rated for, and then under and over temperature. Those are and if the BMS sees any of those conditions happening, that's sort of an immediate shut off for that portion of the BESS. So that could be like, okay, we're seeing over temperature challenges in this module. That's going to be, the BMS is going to stop that module from participating, and sort of check out what's wrong, try to figure out what's going on, and prevent any, warranty damage, any safety events from occurring.
Yeah, I mean, from my limited
Right.
understanding, I think the warranty question can be a pretty complex one, can't it? And sorry, Steve, were you going to jump in with a thought on that?
Oh, I was just thinking that, yeah, like the BMS kind of automatically prevents any safety issues from taking place, right? So it'll start to derate the asset once it hits a point where voltage could get concerning. But it doesn't have to be like a hard cutoff at 5% or 95%. It can be, going beyond those bounds, and perhaps power starts to derate, but you can still get energy. So it's kind of a question of what point does the power start to derate versus providing full power. And it's like a question that we'd like to answer. And it can also not trip, but like you'll hit imbalance at a certain percentage as well. And we want to identify where that's at. But yeah, some warranties, some LTSAs out there, there's a bunch of them might have that in there, but that's not something that we see as a fundamental limit, like 5 to 95%.
Okay, and kind of on that, somewhat related to that subject, but also that we had quite a few questions around cell imbalance, and I think with worst case scenario stuff, particularly when it comes to safety and fires, worst case scenarios are things that you obviously never want to see happen, but kind of have to plan for. So John's question is around cell imbalance leading to localized circulating currents, which lead to temperature rise. What is an acceptable level of imbalance, and for how long before you encounter thermal runaway?
Yeah, this was one of the questions that I was thinking about as I answered the sort of last question about how we manage safety in those cases. I think 2 levels of safety that sort of immediately jump to mind here when we think about resolving imbalance. I guess the one reason that imbalance can cause an increase in temperature is because if you resolve imbalance through passive balancing, you're basically discharging through a resistor to create heat and bring that cell back into balance. At Wärtsilä, this is something I work closely with our hardware team on, making sure that that amount of heat that can be dissipated is managed appropriately and is never going to be significant enough to cause thermal challenges that harm safety. And then our second level of sort of protection there is that BMS measuring the temperature of cells, of boards, and of key places in the BESS to make sure that any sort of thermal challenge is going to be sort of nipped in the bud as soon as we get to even a place that might start to harm batteries.
Okay, awesome. And we had a few questions around round trip efficiency, which I guess we kind of, sort of touched on, but didn't get too into. So Herbert's question is around how you define round trip efficiency. And I mean, I think there's a couple of other questions around it, but yeah, I guess if you could, let's say, demystify that particular metric for anyone with lingering doubts in that area. That would be awesome.
Yeah, happy to kick off and Andrea jump in. But for round trip efficiency, we're thinking energy in at point of interconnect compared to energy out. That would be taking into the most possible efficiencies. There are many other efficiency measurements, at points in between there. But that is what we're looking at, and probably what's most relevant to asset operators, because they're paying for the energy charged at the point of interconnect, and then committing to the amount of energy that's being dispatched to the grid at the point of interconnect. Um, Obviously, we want this to be as high as possible. One of the things that GEMS Pulse does is that we are tracking this and other efficiencies on a long-term basis, so that we can see if there are any changes in it, whether they be like seasonal or due to some other change in the system, and we can identify, like maybe this is something to look into. But this is often something that's committed to in an LTSA, and something that we think is useful to track over the long term and see trends to proactively figure out, like, if it's higher than usual, what's going on. If it's lower, we could start to dig in and try to figure out what a root cause might be.
Awesome. And Andrea, any thoughts to add on that?
No, I think, Steve, you nailed it there.
Beautifully done. Beautifully done. Shall we just do a couple more? I mean, we're pretty much at the end of time, but end of time? I hope not. I mean, the end of our time on the webinar. But
no meteorite coming for me.
What? So should we just maybe do a couple more of these? And then, obviously with the proviso that we have dozens of great questions come in, and, the Wärtsilä team, Steve, Andrea, and their colleagues will be more than happy to follow up with those. But it would be nice to get a couple more of these done before we say goodbye for today, I think.
Sure.
So Matt's, you got a couple of questions in, so thank you very much for asking them. And I think we'll go with this one. So is the dependency of depth of discharge on rate of degradation linear and consistent through different state of charge? So you often hear the tips to avoid cycling batteries at near full or near empty state of charge because degradation is particularly high. I think you noted, Andrea, and I've heard this before around particularly people talking about iPhone battery tips. Don't overcharge it. I mean, don't keep it charging all the time. Don't always keep it near empty. I'm kind of a always near empty, unfortunately, kind of guy, but yeah. With more specific regard to Matt's question, so depth of discharge and that impact, whether that's linear and consistent through different states of charge.
Yeah, from what we've seen, it is not linear, and that when you get to the extremes, I don't know if it's an extreme, but in the high 90s or really close to zero, that will have more of an outsized impact on degradation. So, for example, if you go from 50% up to 100%, that's going to have a greater impact than 25% to 75%. Sort of equivalent, both 50% depth of discharge, but as you mentioned in the question, we're starting at a different SoC rate. So the more you stay in the middle of that SoC range, given a fixed depth of discharge, the lower the degradation rate that we'll see. And once we start to, I don't remember the precise value, but it starts, the curve starts to do one of these situations where it becomes no longer linear once we get up into the high range of depth of discharge. So that is definitely a good point and something to keep in mind when thinking about how assets operate. So yeah,
cool.
keep that in mind with your phone, Andy, too.
I was about to ask if you had any handy tips for the phone. Yeah. Okay, so let's.
I'd add one more.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
I'd add one more thing to Steve's answer there, which is that I think this is one of the areas that it's interesting to look at some of those scenario generation tools that Steve talked about when considering how to operate an asset. Heavier operation is always going to lead to increased degradation, and the question is how can asset operators manage that trade-off? What is worth it to them? And knowing what will happen is the most important thing there.
Right, and it might be something like, hey, you've been operating in a 60% depth of discharge, but you've been going from like 95 to 35. Looking at our calculations, maybe you should shift that down a bit and go from 80 to 60 type of situation. So yeah, there are definitely some, with the scenario generation, GEMS Pulse capabilities, some interesting applications there, like you said, Andrea.
Awesome. Okay. And I just want to wrap up, I think, with because we had quite a few questions on imbalance. And as I keep saying, we can't do all of them, sadly, but I think it would be nice if we managed to give the audience a bit of a double whammy. And so, Chris, thank you for your question, asking on definition of cell imbalance and how it's calculated. Now, Andrea, I know you did kind of run through that, but I think it's always good to have a recap for those in the back, so to speak. But then also Cesar asks how you solve the imbalance and weak cells problems, and what is the approximate cost of doing that? And I suppose there's not, literally cost in dollar terms, let's say, but what potential impacts and how you mitigate them. So yeah, quick definition of cell imbalance and the calculation thereof, and then how you solve that problem, really, I guess.
For sure. So, complicated topic that we only touched on briefly, but cell imbalance is when you see a different state of charge, when you're calculating the state of charge for each cell, and you notice a difference there. And as that difference, say makes it to the top of the charge, and you see one cell hit 100%, and your say another cell is imbalance between these two cells is really bad. That cell's only at 70% state of charge. Multiply that by capacity, and you're getting the sort of the imbalance that, or the capacity that you're losing. Happy to answer any of these questions, if we have a sort of follow-up session more directly. And then we would look to resolve this in a couple of different ways. The first, and the one that's happening continuously, is cell balancing. This is, at least at Wärtsilä, this is built into our BESS, and that's happening all the time, sort of in the background, and resolving some of those issues there, sort of all the time at hardware level for the price you initially paid for the hardware sort of cost. The next sort of level up, if that can't be resolved, is a manual balancing. That's a service interaction, probably, at Wärtsilä, probably covered in your LTSA, something like that. And then finally, if there's such a challenge there from degradation, potentially like a failed cell balancer, then you're looking at a replacement, would be sort of the highest level of, or like the most aggressive intervention.
Yeah, and I'd say in terms of building on what you said, Andrea, in terms of cost to someone who's doing the balancing, not a big cost, but I guess there is like some efficiencies. So for example, if you need to bring the system down to a point below 20% SoC where it can trigger a cell balancing plan, and that movement wasn't part of a market trade, you're transferring energy from one system to another potentially, and there's a little bit of efficiency loss there. And then actually when the cells do balance, we're bleeding off the energy of the higher cells, and so some of that, there's a little bit of efficiency losses there too. And they're not super substantial, but this is part of that process.
And awesome. I guess a trade-off to be looked at in Pulse as well, to say like, is it better to have imbalance, live with this level of imbalance, or to, maybe take this string offline for a few days, let service come in, perform manual balancing, and come back stronger. Sorry.
Okay, super. No, not at all. Not at all. I feel bad for cutting you guys off in your full flow, really, to be honest. And from my point of view, I'm going to have to stop looking at the questions because I'm too tempted to keep firing them at you. So let's draw a line under what's been a great session today. It just remains for me, I think, to thank Wärtsilä, and of course our great speakers, Steve, Merrick, and Andrea and Meister. Thank you so much for your time and expertise. I will likely be leaning on you for more knowledge and insights, if you don't mind, on an informal basis at some point. And most of all, our biggest thanks, of course, from all of us goes to you, the audience, not only for taking part in the webinar today, but also for taking part in this fantastic industry and continuing to help drive it forwards in the really positive ways that we see, not only as a business, but of course, for the bigger aims that I think we all really got here in the first place to work towards. So yeah, thank you from all of us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you so much. Goodbye for now.